Hello Bookbellas and fellas, Kira here, and today I'm going to be doing my wrap-up for the months of March, April, and May. It's been about 3 months since I've done a wrap-up, so I'm going to try to put this into 2 parts. Maybe it'll extend to 3. Not really sure where we're going with this yet, but I do have a lot of books to talk about because I have been reading up a storm, in spite of the fact that I haven't been filming. But I am very anxious to be able to share a lot of this with you because I have actually had a ton of really good books that I just could not pull myself away from. So I'm just going to go ahead and get into the reviews. One of the first books that I read in the month of March was The Test by Sylvain Neuvel, which is the same one that wrote Waking Gods. And this was a short story, a short science fiction story surrounding Idir, who is a Muslim Iranian. Well, in this is kind of a futuristic style story where they are taking a test to see if they can become a part of this ideal community. But the only person that is allowed to take this test is a male. So females are not allowed to take this test. But if Idir takes this test and he passes it, then he will be able to get in along with his family into this ideal community. There's actually a trigger warning in this for violence, kidnapping, hostage situations. It's very intense for what it is. It actually is very psychological as well. It implements a lot of psychological principles into the story itself, and then it applies them, which I felt was very interesting. I enjoyed this overall story, but I do realize that it's a short story, but I do not feel like it was fleshed out enough. Like, I don't know specifically like why they were taking the test, and I didn't feel like I knew enough about the outside world and why they were so desperate to get into this ideal community. Idir, it was a very well thought out character. I love the characters like in this, the fact that it was a short story, but overall I didn't feel like, in spite of that it was still fleshed out enough that I was satisfied with it. I ended up giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars just because I really would have liked more surrounding the situation rather than the situation itself. The next book that I read was a very short book, and it was really awesome, and I know it's been circulating around BookTube for quite a while. It is The Tea Dragon Society. I have been seeing this book literally everywhere. I was very curious about it, so I ended up getting it, and I read it. You know, of course, it's a very quick read. It's got these cute little illustrations. I love the illustrations so much. They are so freaking amazing. And, you know, I can honestly see like that this is going to be a story that's going to be really good for both adults and kids, because it's cute enough for kids, but it's mature enough and sweet enough for adults. Like, it surrounds family and everything. So I absolutely love this. I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars because obviously, like, this is just an amazing little book. I love it. It's not thick at all. It's all told in graphic novel format, and I absolutely loved it. It's about these little tea dragons that grow flowers, and these flowers are turned into tea. When you drink the tea, you actually start remembering things that the dragons remembered. It's a very visual experience. So I really enjoyed this immensely. The next book that I have to talk about is Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson. This is the 3rd and final book in the Mistborn trilogy. I have to tell you that this book was incredible. I've heard nothing but amazing things about the series for I don't know how long, but I can honestly say that this was well worth it. This put me into a fantasy slump for like over a month, and that has never happened to me before. It's not the fact that I wasn't in the mood to read. After giving myself this kind of perfection, this interaction with perfection, I just couldn't believe, like, it absolutely blew my mind. Everything came together perfectly at the end, and I just could not fathom a more perfect ending to the series. Now, the first book, of course, like, was, you know, like, okay, like, it was Mistborn, it set everything up, and it gave you a real feel for the world. Now, the second book, The Well of Ascension, was better than the first book in my opinion, but this book trumps all 3, and it was just amazing. I don't want to say too much about this because I don't want to ruin anything as far as the first 2 books, because this is the 3rd book in a series. But all I can say is that if you get through the first book and you don't absolutely positively love it, just be patient, because the 3rd book, by the time you reach the 3rd book, you're going to have your mind utterly blown and you're not going to know what to do with yourself. I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars because a book that can put me into a fantasy slump is well worth it. The next book that I read was Shout by Laurie Halse Anderson. This is the same author that wrote Speak. I personally have never read Speak myself, and when I saw this, it was sold to me as a story in poetry format, and I really do like those stories in poetry formats. This did reference Speak. You do not have to read Speak in order to really understand this. I felt like the author did a really good job of giving me a good feel for Speak without actually telling me the entire story of Speak. So I really enjoyed this. This is very intense. There is a trigger warning for rape. It's just a very gritty book in some ways, but it's also very tender and it's very soft, and I think it was just so many things that I really appreciated. I loved it. It was both beautiful and disturbing at the same time, but it was also extremely uplifting because it's very about female empowerment, and I love the books like that really give you a sense of empowerment. Being a woman and, you know, having to deal like with rape culture and everything else, you find that people, like, they don't really take it seriously unless they are completely aware of it, and I kind of feel like this book really kind of emphasized that as well, and it kind of like really dug into a lot of the things behind inequality, and, you know, like how, you know, some things in some contexts are okay and in other contexts they're not okay, even though it's the exact same thing. And it's not the fact that even like that they're maybe okay, but the fact that we turn a blind eye to them because they are in one context. That context is a little bit more like, oh, we need to stay away from that. Whereas other contexts, that same thing is, oh, well, we need to attack this. So I really like how it kind of emphasized that as well. Of course, this was another 5 out of 5 stars for me, and I absolutely loved it. It was downright beautiful, and it was a really quick read, and I really loved it. With the movie coming out, I had to read this. I still have not had a chance to see the movie yet. I think I missed that in theaters, which I'm kind of upset about, but that's fine because I'm sure it'll be on Blu-ray, DVD before I know it. However, I've been seeing this book everywhere, and I didn't really think like about it when I saw it. I knew it was very diverse, but I didn't realize how hard it was going to hit right here. It's The Sun is also a star by Nicola Yoon. I literally read this in about a day because I was so obsessed with it. I could not tear myself away. This book takes place in alternating viewpoints between Daniel, who has an intense Korean heritage, and Natasha, who is a very logical Jamaican immigrant, and she's getting ready to be deported back to Jamaica. Well, she is on her way to the immigration building to see if she can try to get it reversed, to see if there's any way that her and her family can stay. On her way there, she ends up running into this really romantically involved poet named Daniel. They're both pretty much the same age, and what I loved about this is it does have an insta-love trope, but the fact of it is that the insta-love trope is done very well, because for Daniel, it's instant love, but for Natasha, it's not. She's very logical. She doesn't really believe in love. She is like the opposite end of the spectrum. I feel like it really rounded out the concept of love very well. I kind of feel like, philosophically speaking, that we all have this thing in our head, a logical voice that tells us this is not logical, this is something that we need to work on, this is not right, this isn't accurate, or, you know, like, this is why it's not accurate. We constantly explain stuff away. Then we have our emotional side that plunges in head first and doesn't look back and just goes into it beneath the surface. And I feel like this book really emphasized that, because Daniel is the emotional head plunging first into the great unknown, and Natasha is the very cautious one. This was extremely emotional. This was very intense, and it was very beautiful, and it referenced, you know, like stars, because Natasha loved stars and everything else, and science, and I can't even get over how much I ended up falling in love with this book, and how well every little detail was done, and how much it not only uplifted me but broke my heart at the same time. And I really just absolutely love this. This was another 5 out of 5 stars for me. Like I said, I've actually ended up reading a ton of really good things the last few months. So the next book that I read was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. When I first saw this book floating around, I'm like, I don't know if I really want to read it. I know it was by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I love The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, but how am I ever going to have anything that's going to remotely live up to that? Well, I'm not saying that this book completely lived up to The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, because let's face it, like, I mean, you can't live up to that book. I mean, you really can't. Like, it would be a shot in the dark, honestly. But this book actually was really amazing in a totally different way. You have like this band of 6 people, and then you have Daisy Jones, who is actually a separate person and a separate singer and songwriter all unto herself, and then they take the band of the 6 and then they take and Daisy Jones, and they end up combining them to form Daisy Jones and the 6. This entire book is written in interview format, where you have the 6 and all the members of the 6 discussing their points of view and stuff that was going on behind the scenes that the other ones may not have known about. And you have Daisy Jones' point of view, you have the managers, you have some of the spouses interacting, and I really felt the entire time I was reading this, it was one of those old VH1 interviews where it's like, you know, like where you hear it from the band first, and the entire like interview and the story is shaped by the responses of the band. And it was a really interesting story, but it also talked like a lot about love. And one of the things that's really stuck with me from this book, more than any other quote that I've had in a long time, is that passion is fire. And some people are fire in your life. If you get too close to them, they're going to burn you. Some people are steady and true, and they're the people like that you lean on when you don't have, when you need them, and they were always going to be there. And those people are water. And the people that are water are the ones like that are there to support you when you need them. The people who are considered fire with passion are the ones that burn you. The actual quote for this is, passion is, it's fire. And fire is great, man, but we're made of water. Water is how we keep living. Water is what we need to survive. And that really hit me really, really hard, like how some people are passion and fire and some people are water. This was another 5 out of 5 star read for me, because so many things in this book just really stuck with me and really captured things perfectly. Okay, sorry, I had to go change out my battery because it was dying. So the next book that I read was Very Good Lies by J.K. Rowling. This is actually J.K. Rowling's commencement speech for Harvard, and there's not a ton of like writing in it. There's quite a few pictures, and while I did enjoy this, I was not fully in love with it. There was a lot of good points that she made in this. There was a lot of really interesting things that had to do with this, and while I really, really, really loved like all the points she made, I felt like she could have done a lot more with this. She really emphasized like the benefits of failing and how her failure actually led to a really big success. Everything that was written in this book was perfect for a commencement speech. But as far as like a book itself, I don't feel like it was perfect for a book. I feel like they could have done more with it. They could have elaborated on it. They could have gone much further with it. And while for what it is, it was good, I didn't absolutely love it, and I wanted more from it. So I ended up giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. So over the last few months, I have been listening to some audiobooks. So I ended up listening to 6 of Crows on audiobook, which was really awesome because this is told from multiple perspectives, and in the audiobook, every perspective has a different voice, a different narrator. And I really liked that because not only did it make it distinct, it kind of like it kind of gave you a little bit more atmosphere, almost like how you were seeing other character from that particular person's perspective. I loved the characters in this. Honestly, like the romance between Nina and Matthias was amazing, and I absolutely loved it. It was kind of like this hate kind of to love trope, which, you know, love that. And I loved how like they were from very diverse backgrounds, and in spite of all that diversity, they still found a way to come together. And yes, I know everybody loves Inej and Kaz because there's a lot more hatred in that, but like there's also like an underlying tenderness, and I get why people would love that couple over maybe some of the other ones. But for me, It was all about Nina and Matthias, and I absolutely love them. This book is all centered around a heist. They don't figure out how to heist this particular person out of this particular situation, then things are going to get really bad for all the Grisha. This is part of Leigh Bardugo's Grisha universe. There are 3 other books, the Shadow and Bone series, which are kind of which kind of predate this and kind of become more of a mythology and backtone to this particular book. They do reference it, but you don't have to read those books, but I kind of feel like you should, just because you won't understand some of the references that they make without it. I feel like understanding those references actually made the story much more rich to me. I understood more, I felt more, and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember those characters. And I really liked that, being able to relate to the things and little Easter eggs from the previous trilogy that they got into. While I absolutely loved all the characters and I loved the world building in this, I felt like the heist wasn't amazing like on a larger scope. Like, it was well thought out, it was well detailed. As far as like, you know, like being far reaching, I didn't really feel it. So I ended up giving this a 4.5 out of 5 stars just because of that, which is still a really high rating, and I still really, really loved it. I just felt like it could have pushed the boundaries a little bit further. And the next book that I listened to an audiobook was, of course, Crooked Kingdom, because this is a duology, and I don't want to say too much regarding this, so I'm going to talk more about structure and talk more about like why I actually liked the first book better than I liked this book. The first book felt like it had a lot more plot development in it. This book actually starts where Six of Crows left off, like directly after. And in this book, we really got to know the characters a lot better. We got to see a lot more of their backgrounds. We really dug into more about who the characters were, where they came from, why they were the way they were. And I loved getting to know the characters better. However, what kind of bothered me about this, it felt like it was kind of all over the place. Like, it didn't like really have, it felt like there was multiple plot lines going on. I didn't feel like there was a huge like converge like between like the final plot line. I kind of felt like the final plot line like was very short in comparison to everything else that was going on. And while I did enjoy this, I feel like that there is kind of a divide between people liking this book better and people liking this book better. And I just feel like I liked this book just a little bit more because the storyline itself, the overarching storyline of this itself, just felt like it was more cohesive and it felt like it flowed a lot better. Granted, we did not get as much character interaction in this as we did with this one, but I still really appreciated Six of Crows a little bit more than I did Crooked Kingdom. So while I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 stars, I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. Once again, still a high rating, still really enjoyed it, but I just felt like that the overall arching storyline of this was just not as concentrated as it was in this book. So that's kind of how I feel about it. Being the fact that I also listened to this on audiobook, it was in the same format as Crooked Kingdom with multiple narrators from multiple perspectives, and I still really love the narration for this. So if you like audiobooks, it's really, really good, and I really enjoyed it. Alright, so the next book is A Heart in the Body in the World. Our main character in this is Annabelle. Annabelle is a runner. She, almost a year back, went through something extremely traumatic and heartbreaking, and it really just shook her entire world and her entire existence. It just really like created such a hole in her life. She ended up seeing a therapist. She just wasn't functioning properly. She felt like she had completely lost control over her life. You could feel the trauma coursing through this book. And they don't really tell you, especially in the beginning, what the trauma is. And I don't really like want to tell you either, because it's going to be a spoiler for you if you know exactly what it is. But what I really liked about it is it started off being one trauma that turned into something that I kind of suspected, but was confirmed pretty much towards the end of the book. What was really uplifting about like this is the fact that they didn't discuss the type of trauma that she went through. It kind of made the courses for trauma a kind of universal idea. After experiencing trauma, there are similar things that we all go through and that we all kind of, you know, feel after something really traumatic has happened to us. And I feel like this book, by not specifically discussing what that specific trauma was at the beginning, aided it in being able to apply to many different conversations about trauma and not necessarily one particular instance of trauma itself. This book was extremely emotional. It was at times very hard to read because of how universal that trauma felt. But I loved this book so much, and it really hit a chord in me. And after I found out like what the trauma was, I felt like I had a lot to relate to in this book. And I really loved it. I saw it floating around on YouTube. I saw lots of people recommending it, and so I finally did get a chance to read it. I ended up reading it fairly quickly. This was another 5 out of 5 stars for me because I just absolutely loved it so much, and it was just so beautiful. Running across country, because she ends up like running from like one area, it's just thousands of miles, and she does it every day until she gets there, and it takes her months to do it. But it's like her running is her way of regaining her control, and every day she's thinking that she can't do it, she cannot get through this, she hurts, she's struggling. And I feel like that had such a parallel to trauma itself and the emotions we go through with traumatic events that happen in our lives. So I really loved the parallels I saw in this. I really loved how we went from one area to another, and it just felt like it was just such an interesting and amazing journey that we got to go on with this character who was deeply affected by this one traumatic event that happened to her. The next book that I read is The Age of Light by Whitney Sherrier. This was another book of the month pick, and this was actually set in historical Paris. It is a historical fiction book. There's no fantasy to it. It's very contemporary, and it actually follows Lee Miller, who is this model who's striving to become more than a model. She wants to become a photographer, and she ends up meeting up with a man named Man Ray. And in historic Paris, he was a very famous photographer, even in real life. I actually ended up looking them up because I wanted to see how much of this was actually based on real life instances. So it is considered a fiction, but it's another one of those things like where the author has collected, like various biographies and everything else about the background of Lee Miller herself, and kind of like goes through and kind of pieces together the parts using fictional accounts to kind of make everything mash together as a cohesive whole. And I really enjoy like those kind of books because it reads like a story, but it's actually has some truth in it, and it's kind of, piecing together like those pieces. And I felt like the author did a really good job piecing together all the pieces of Lee Miller. Lee Miller was never really a huge name in Paris. It was always about Man Ray. Man Ray was the historic photographer, even though at one point Lee Miller had taken some very famous photos that Man Ray had taken some credit for lovers, and she was his apprentice for a while. And this was very, very dense. Not like dense in the way like that was hard to understand dense, but dense in the way like that there was vintage photography references everywhere. Everything from developing film to taking pictures and like using special effects, like underexposing the photographs to overexposing the photographs to create various effects. While I enjoy this, I don't think this book was for me. Yes, it gave me a deeper appreciation for all of the vintage photographers and like what they had to do, like because they didn't have filters back then. They didn't have Instagram. They didn't have places like where they could digitally alter the photographs. They had to use tricks for it. So while this did give me a lot better view of how they did things and a lot more of appreciation for photography itself, I just don't think this book was for me. I think like that it was kind of very slow in some instances, and there was so much discussion about photography that I just wasn't really into as much as I probably should have been. And while I do have a greater love for vintage photography now, I don't feel like I don't feel like this book was for me. I ended up rating this a 3.5 out of 5 stars just because I think it was probably meant for somebody who was more into vintage photography than I am. I like the modern stuff. I like the filters, and all that. I guess if it's truly a thing like where you're into photography, like, and you're still developing film and stuff like that, this book would definitely be for you. And not to mention like all the angsty romance that goes on between Man Ray and Lee Miller, and it gives you a really good account of Lee Miller. But once again, this book just wasn't for me. All right, book bellas and fellas, that is going to be the end of my part 1. I think I'm going to be able to put this into 2 parts, which is great. So I'm going to continue on in our next video talking about my wrap-up, and we're going to be going into more of the rest of my June reads and what I read in May, because there was still a lot of really good books like that I've been reading. This year has been amazing for books, and I hope you guys really like this video. If you like this video, hit the little like, hit subscribe, and hit the little bell icon if you want to receive emails every time I post. I am also on Twitter, Amazon, Goodreads, and Instagram. Those links are in the description below, and I will see you guys again for wrap up part 2 very, very soon.